Welcome to the teaching ministry of B.D. Hyman. B.D. Hyman's teachings will prepare you to face life's difficult challenges through the power and knowledge of God's Word. Join us now as we discover the truth in God's Word with B.D. Hyman.
Hello and welcome. I am continuing today with my testimony and how I got from where I was to where I am today, which is a very unlikely story, one only God could put together. In 1965, my husband Jeremy and I moved to Connecticut from Manhattan, where we had begun our marriage in 1963. And in 1969, our son Ashley was born. We had a wonderful life. We thoroughly enjoyed Connecticut. But my mother's intrusiveness, my mother Betty Davis, who was the poster girl for the spirit of control, became constantly more invasive and potentially more destructive. At least that was her desire in our lives. And we realized that we really had to put some distance between her and us for all our sakes. And so in 1976, we bought a horse farm in Pennsylvania. We chose a very remote area, more cows than people, northeast corner of Pennsylvania. And we figured we were so far out of the mainstream that we could escape Mother's destructive desires in our family. Yes, I would have to deal with her on the telephone, but that was that. And there was no way that her managers and lawyers, etc., would allow her to live in the northeast corner of Pennsylvania in the middle of dairy country. There wasn't even a local airport that had commercial traffic. So we thought we really had this nailed. Okay, we loved horses. Jeremy had always ridden horses. He was an Englishman. We shared that as we shared many things in common. And so we took our horses and our son, who by then was about 7, and we moved to Pennsylvania. We thought we had escaped. In 1977, our second son, Justin, was born, and we just enjoyed being an island unto ourselves. But the mother situation did not improve. Now that we were that far away and could only be reached after a 3-hour car trip from Manhattan, Mother decided to come and stay for prolonged periods of time. If you've ever dealt with someone with the spirit of control, you know that stopping this person is not an easy task. And Mother would simply announce she was coming, and she would get in her limousine, and he would drive her to our mountaintop farm. And every time she came, we would get limousine sightings. The locals who knew who she was, because she had made that abundantly clear, and I will tell you how in a moment. The locals would call me as she wound her way up our mountain to our farm, telling me that they'd just seen her limousine pass. They knew it was her because no one else had a limousine. They'd never even seen a limousine until we moved there and my mother started making regular visits. And the problem grew worse because she would arrive and she would just stay. And her demonic presence would invade the household, would invade every waking minute. And she was escalating in her determination, as this thing does, to have things her way and get me apart from Jeremy. Well, we moved to the farm and we renovated it. We bought a centennial farmhouse and we spent the first 6 months, we thought it was going to be 2, turned out to be 6, what else is new, renovating this farmhouse. Jeremy did all the carpentry and all of that, and I did cleanup and painting, and we worked constantly. But we loved the place. We loved the farm. We loved the landscape, the area, everything about it. And Mother phoned and announced she was coming to visit. And I told her not to, in most emphatic terms, because we had not quite finished the renovation. And for reasons that are quite obvious, the guest room was the last thing to be done. And we told her there was no place for her to stay with us because we had not completed the renovation. And she said, that's no problem, I'll stay in a local hotel. And I said, Mother, you don't seem to understand how far out into the country we are. The only hotel, if you will, is a motel, very small, about 45 minutes from here. And it is not what you're used to, trust me. It is a rural motel. And she said, I don't care. My secretary and I are coming. I want to see the farm. So she arrived. And she arrived with all of her usual fanfare and pretended she thought it was all wonderful and was thrilled to be there. Had a lot of criticisms about certain things, but it seemed that it was going okay. We were kind of amazed. And so we had dinner, and she went back down to the motel. And when she got there, she was apparently, according to what I heard from her secretary later and others, quite beside herself. And she said she needed a drink. She'd consumed all the alcohol she'd brought with her already, and she needed a drink. And so she proceeded to go into the village and go to the one and only local bar. Now, this is where all the folks there congregated. Everybody who was there was related to everybody else who lived in the entire area. Farmers, truck drivers, workers at the meat plant, all of them. And into this, my mother sweeps and sits down at a table. And of course, everybody recognizes her. We had tried to keep a very low profile. We hadn't wanted anybody to know about Mother, about where we came from or anything else. We really just wanted to make friends and try to fit in. Well, that was over, because there was Mother. She was drunk, getting drunker, bellowing at the top of her lungs, as she always did. Mother was not a quiet person. And telling Catherine at the top of her lungs, in front of all these people, that she couldn't believe, absolutely couldn't believe, that Jeremy would have dragged me to this, now her words, God-forsaken armpit. Only her language is a lot more colorful than I am willing to repeat on this program. That Jeremy had dragged me and stuck me in this God-forsaken place with all of these hicks, among whom she is sitting at the time she is spewing all of this, and how her grandsons are going to be ignorant and have to have their friends, the children of these ignorant hicks. And it went on and on and on. I spent weeks afterward apologizing to everybody I saw. We had made quite a few friends in the first few months before Mother's appearance. And I apologized, and I apologized, and I told them that this was not the way we saw it, that my mother was just a really strange person and they shouldn't pay any attention to her. But this was the kind of thing she did. And as we put up with her visits, which continued, she would continue to come whenever she wanted, and eventually we did finish renovating the house, and we did have a guest room, and she did stay in the guest room, and she did cause a lot of problems. And she was a person who just turned everything dark. And it got so bad that I wound up going to our local doctor. Remember, this is before we met the Lord. And telling him that I was having terrible indigestion and nervousness and couldn't sleep and so on. And he asked if this coincided with my mother's visits, and I said, well, yes, it did. And he said, well, you're fine the rest of the time. I said, yes. He said, well, while she's here, I'm going to prescribe you Valium, because that way you can stay calm and just kind of weather it better. So I stayed on tranquilizers the whole time she was with us, every time, just to stay sane. And eventually, one of the first things that the Lord delivered me from was colitis, because I had a very bad case of colitis from nervousness and just nastiness to do with her. And it was an amazing thing to look back on when I did this, because the lengths that she went to were extraordinary. Well, in 1982, her managers insisted that she move back to California to be closer to her work. And so she did. She moved back to Beverly Hills, and then started all of the pleading and begging from the managers, the lawyers, that mother was distraught. She was beside herself. This was something that happened all the time. She was always distraught and beside herself and trying to get me to go to where she was, and having her managers and lawyers call me to tell me that she was far more important than I was, and that I needed to do whatever it was that filled her needs. And most of the time, I did not. And this time, they told me that she was just beside herself. She couldn't work. She couldn't do anything, because I hadn't been to California to see her new home. And I had to go see her new home. So they finally talked us into taking our winter vacation to California. Well, we stayed at the Beverly Hills Hotel. We got a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel, which I'd always liked. And Jeremy and I and Justin and Ashley were there. And there was no way that they were going to spend any extensive time in her house. But she did somehow convince me, just to calm her down, to spend the night at her house. And Justin wanted to stay with me. He was a little guy then, he was 5. And so he and I spent the night at her house. And it was a real eye-opener, because this seems to have been her last-ditch attempt to wreck my life and cause me to run back to her. She was doing all sorts of satanic things. She was going through a lot of her rituals, and it was very uncomfortable while we were there. Jeremy and Ashley had gone back to the hotel. They were not there anymore. They'd had dinner with us, and then they'd gone back. And so we went to bed early. And Justin had a cot at the side of the bedroom that I was using. And it was not long before I felt a tremendous spirit of fear come on me. And so I went around and I locked the doors, which was strange to do in her house, but I did. And I locked the doors to the terrace. There was a separate terrace outside the room that I was in. And I locked the French doors to the terrace. And we were sitting there, Justin and I were sitting there watching television, and all of a sudden, she appeared on this balcony. Now, I'd never seen this level of the operation of the occult with her, and I still didn't know Jesus, and I still didn't understand what I was seeing. I thought perhaps I was going mildly crazy. But I saw her come onto this terrace outside the French doors and begin to rattle the French doors. And then she began cackling, very just demonic cackling. At that point, I actually watched her, and so did Justin, transform into a satanic figure, a satanic face, long claws on the end of her hands, scraping at the glass. It was chilling. And I didn't know Jesus. I didn't know how to plead the blood against it. I didn't know how to deal with it at all. I wasn't even sure what on earth it was. All I knew was I wanted to get out of there, and I never wanted to be back there again or have my children near her again. And so the next morning, she finally left, and we went to sleep. And the next morning, when we left her home, I determined that that was the last time I was ever going to stay with her, the last time she was ever going to be near my children, and that finally I had to do something about this. So I cut off all contact with her, except she would call me constantly, and I would just kind of stonewall the conversations, and I would absolutely refuse to allow her to come and become so unpleasant about it that she'd back off slightly. And I decided the only way to separate her life from mine was to write a book. I had tried screaming, I tried writing letters, I tried pleading, I tried everything I knew how to do in the natural realm. And so I decided to write a book about her life with me, or my life with her, more accurately. And I figured she would be so outraged that I would write a book, no matter what was in it, that she would go away. And as a matter of fact, she did. And at that moment in time, unbeknownst to me, when I'd finished the book and already sold it, our lives were about to change totally. They were about to be turned upside down. And it's an interesting thing about the Lord. He enters one's life at times when we desperately need Him, even though we don't know it. I wasn't looking for a source outside of myself to deal with this situation. I was not looking for any supernatural occurrence in my life. I didn't believe anything except what I could see and touch. And yet things were about to turn around. And when our lives totally changed, when God sent this wonderful man into our lives to be a witness for Christ, it was a radical change. It came out of the blue, literally, out of the blue. The change began one day when, in a fierce blizzard, I opened our kitchen door to a man who was delivering a coupon book from the local Chamber of Commerce that we'd agreed to buy. It was a blizzard. We were on top of a mountain on dirt roads. Nobody in their right mind drove up there if they didn't have to, that kind of weather. But he told us later that he felt impressed of God, that he was to deliver that book that day. The boy who was supposed to deliver it had had a mild accident with his car, and his father had said he couldn't drive the car until the insurance company looked at it. And so this man's name was Serafino. He really felt it was important to make the delivery himself. And so he walked into our kitchen, and we invited him in and said, "Oh my goodness, you're covered in snow and ice. Come in and thaw out and get warm." And in the course of the afternoon, he talked to us about his relationship with the Lord. He never quoted the Bible. He just told us about how Jesus had changed his life. And I obviously was ready to hear it, because the things that he was saying truly pierced my heart. Jeremy was intellectually interested, but I was feeling a stirring inside myself that I'd never felt before. Now, I thought I'd solved my problem with my mother. I'd written the book, she'd gone away, and I thought I'd handled the whole thing. I wasn't aware of the effect of her witchcraft on me or on my children. I wasn't aware of the forces that were at work to try and prevent me from getting to where I am today. But the Lord knew, and Satan had used my mother to the best of his ability, because even though she recognized no power but her own, the devil can work with that. Even though she didn't recognize or serve him or worship him, he can work with anyone who is into power apart from God. And he sure did with her. And I can remember many times when she would sit in her bed. Her bed was kind of her throne. She would spend days and days in her bed with her scripts all around her, having people bring her food and bring her things and making her phone calls. And she would sit on her bed, and she had this big metal wastebasket. And she would have her secretary get a piece of clothing from someone who had vexed her, crossed her in her view. And she would take this piece of clothing, and she would mumble incoherently, and she would then set it on fire and hold it over this metal wastebasket and laugh as it burned and she dropped it into this container. People's lives were destroyed. They fell apart. All sorts of horrible things happened to them. But I still never put the supernatural together in my thinking with it. I watched it and I saw it, but it was just something my mother did. It was just some weird thing that was to do with her, and that's the way I viewed it. But when this man walked through our kitchen door in the middle of this fierce blizzard, when he shouldn't even have been there, our lives were about to change, and I was about to find out what it was really all about. The whole story is in this testimony set. Long Day's Journey into Light. Bless God, light where I am now. And when the Lord enters your life, it should turn everything upside down. It should completely change many of your concepts and precepts. And it certainly did with me. I was absolutely astonished that I was listening to what he had to say, that I really suddenly, at least to me it seemed suddenly, I realized God had been preparing me, but I suddenly needed to know whether Jesus was real. I needed to know whether there was more, whether there was a greater concept, a greater reality than just the here and now. I'd always adhered to the idea, very secular idea, that if you make one person happy, then you've accomplished your mission on life and in life. And we basically, in my view, I guess, were just like little ants, because I didn't believe in heaven or hell. I didn't think anything went beyond our lives here. We just were born and we lived and we did whatever we did and we died and death was an end. I had no idea that the things I'd heard about to do with the Lord, to do with heaven and hell, were real. But somehow this man was chosen by God to be our perfect witness. He said the things that I needed to hear and didn't even know it. He presented an image of who God was that was not religious, that was not part of the religion that I had hated all my life. And I was drawn. I was intrigued. And suddenly I had to know. And it consumed me. And I focused. I was amazed that I was so drawn, because I really had never had any interest. I wasn't antagonistic toward the Lord or the things of the Lord, but I'd had no interest. I didn't like religion. I still don't. Religion is not what God gave us. He gave us a relationship, but I didn't know there was a difference until Serafino explained it. And so he was indeed our perfect witness. And over the next few weeks, I read the Bible nonstop. And at a certain point, I realized that Jesus was real and that I needed him. And I made a commitment to Christ. We at this point had not only finished writing, or I had finished writing the book, and Jeremy had been involved completely in the editing process. And we had finished the book, we had sold the book, and it was on the verge of being published. It had all been kept very secret so that Mother and her lawyers could not interfere. But now I didn't know what to do, because it was not a book that had anything to do with the Lord. It was a very rough kind of book in certain areas, funny in other areas, but it was the story of my mother and myself, and it was not pleasant, and there was a lot of bad language in it, because that's the way she spoke. And so I didn't know where to go with this at that point. And Jeremy was still not very interested. Well, over the next while, the Lord made it clear through various means, various people and prophetic words, that I was to go ahead with the book, that it was part of God's plan, that his timing of bringing me to himself was specific, and the book needed to go ahead. So we went ahead with that, and meanwhile, I believed and Jeremy didn't, and this was very troubling to me, as it is to many people with their spouses. I had an incurable back disease. It was one thing that I had been kind of in denial about. I wasn't in faith, I was literally in denial. But I had a very bad condition in the short ligaments in my spine. I was on pain pills, I was on muscle relaxers just to be able to get around. The diagnosis had been that by the time I was 40, at that point I was 36, I would be in a wheelchair with a back brace to even be able to sit up, and there was nothing that could be done about it. It was literally incurable and progressive. And so when Serafino and his wife Joan were leaving to go back to West Virginia, where their home was, they'd been in Pennsylvania on business, Serafino asked Jeremy what it would take to convince him that Jesus was real. And Jeremy thought for a moment, and he said, well, if Beatty's back is healed, and Serafino knew about my back condition, if her back is healed, it would be a miracle, because there is no known cure. And if it's a miracle, then Jesus must be who he says he is. And Serafino smiled and said, remember you said that, because God's in the miracle business. And I continued to pray every day, Lord, please, get through to Jeremy, do something, because I hate this separation. We've been one in everything for 20 years. I just really hate being apart in this, probably the most important thing that's ever been. And so one day, I was watching a television program, and the man had a word of knowledge about my specific back condition. I received healing, and I told Jeremy about it, and he demonstrated how strong my back was all day long. The whole story of it is in the testimony set. And by the end of the day, he just stood there and said, Jesus obviously is who he says he is, and I will begin reading the Bible. So that's where Jeremy began, and it began because he'd made a kind of contract with the Lord that if my back were miraculously healed, and it was miraculously healed, then he would believe. And Ashley was 13 at the time, Justin was 5. They both believed. And from that point forward, we began charting a new course. And I will tell you what happened next in the next program, because things really began to be dramatic. They really began to change radically. And it was a little terrifying and also very exciting. So I will share all that with you next time. Meanwhile, remember, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.
We trust that you have been encouraged in God's Word during this broadcast. If you have and would like others to enjoy the teaching, write to us. Or to order materials or to make a gift by phone, you can by calling the phone number on the screen.